And welcome to everybody who's joined us. It's really nice to have you here. I'm Sheldon Himmelfarb, the CEO of Peacetechlab, headquartered here in Washington, D.C. We are an independent nonprofit organization that was spun out from one of our co-hosts today, the U.S. Institute of Peace, almost 8 years ago now. And our mission, simply put, is to amplify the power of technology to prevent violent conflict and help build just and peaceful communities in the US and around the world. Or, as we like to say at the lab, we put the right tools in the right hands so that those courageous hands can do more, better, faster. Since that really is what tech does, it is a force multiplier for good and, of course, for evil, as we are going to be discussing here in a moment. But first, let me give a huge shout out. Thank you to Alliance for Peace Building and the USIP PeaceCon team. We've loved being part of this event several years in a row now and are just really happy that despite the challenges of 2022, you all managed to keep this really important event alive. So thank you all. I know how much work goes into putting something like this on. Now, the subject that we're discussing today is one I've personally been steeped in for quite a while, since I have been working in the conflict area since the Mesozoic era, and fake news is not a new phenomena. But its prevalence and its risk factor, the volume and velocity with which it circles the globe today, that is really new. In fact, unprecedented in human history. And I have come to believe, along with many others, that it is one of the greatest threats to our planet. And let me make this come alive with a quick firsthand story from our work at the Peacetechlab. In 2016, in the Equatoria region of South Sudan, members of the Dinka ethnic group were pulled off buses and shot in a series of ambushes. Over 31 people lost their lives. And working with local nonprofits, the lab was able to link these attacks to social media posts that had called for violence against the Dinka people, online hate speech and disinformation, which had originated from diaspora communities in the United States. Misinformation from the US spreading around the world through social media and getting innocent people killed in South Sudan. And sadly, this is just one example of the deadly and dangerous global impact of misinformation. And of course, its evil stepchildren, disinformation and hate speech. We have seen similar incidents where misinformation has directly caused mob violence in India, in Myanmar, Mexico, and elsewhere. We have seen misinformation contributing to climate change, denialism, impeding critical action to protect the planet. We've seen Russian disinformation operations targeting US elections, sowing doubt and distrust among the electorate and undermining our democracy. Misinformation played a key role in instigating the January 6th attack on the US Capitol. And of course, there is the deadly role of misinformation in today's pandemic. Just a few months ago, I heard the outgoing director of NIH, Dr. Francis Collins, stating 100,000 people were estimated to have died from COVID-19 needlessly, unvaccinated, most of them because someone gave them information that was demonstrably false, that said, you don't want this vaccine, it's dangerous. That's 100,000 deaths he attributed to misinformation of the 800,000 plus that have occurred in this country. I could go on, and probably should, because I honestly don't think that people appreciate the magnitude of this global problem. I don't even think our policymakers appreciate this, which is why you may have heard 2 months ago, the Aspen Commission on information came out calling very strenuously for a policy. We need a policy in coming out of the White House, a strategy for countering misinformation. I believe it's an existential threat. It is the one problem, as I have heard you, Phil, one of our panelists, say to me many times, it is the problem that prevents so many other problems from being solved. So today, with this terrific panel, we want to talk about solutions. I'm going to be really trying to steer us in the direction of solutions because there's no time to waste. This really is an existential problem. A lot of ideas are being discussed, from ways to hold the social media platforms more responsible for their content, to media literacy education starting from a young age, to reinvesting in local journalism, and even architecting the internet itself. But we have got a terrific group here from around the world. And what better way to explore the good ideas that are out there than with this cross section of experts, which I'll talk about more about in a minute. For my part, full disclosure, I'm very excited about a proposal the lab first made last May at the Nobel Prize Foundation Solutions Summit, calling for the creation of an international panel for the information environment, modeled after the IPCC, in order to establish an international scientific consensus on this crisis and provide analysis to inform policy options, just as the IPCC has done for climate change. This is what we meant when we titled the session, "Is the Solution Perhaps in Plain Sight?" But let me hear what our panelists are doing, or what you're getting excited about, because each of you have dealt with this problem firsthand, but from very different sectors or experiences. We've got a veteran diplomat from Finland in Jarmo, a broadcaster from Nigeria in John, a paragon of peace building with lots of international experience from the Kroc Institute in Indiana, and Lisa, and a scholar from Oxford, Phil, whose latest book title pretty much says it all, Phil. I think you just nailed it. The title of Phil's book, Lie Machines: How to Save Democracy from Troll Armies, Deceitful Robots, Junk News Operations, and Political Operatives. So you can tell just from that title how the scale, the order of magnitude, how well organized the problem is. And I should also add, we thought we would have a fifth panelist as well, a colleague from a major social media company, but we learned very late in the day that she couldn't make it. But that means we get to spend more time with each of these incredible panelists. And I'll talk a little bit more about your backgrounds as we go to the Q&A. And speaking of questions, let me tell folks that are joined us, we will have time. We'll make sure we leave some time for Q&A towards the end of the session. So put your questions into the chat window, and our team will pass them on to me. So to borrow from the title of Phil's book, let's get started saving democracy. And I'd love to start with you, Jarmo, if I might. I've known you for many years. You always bring to me, it's great to look through your eyes into these American discussions. You were previously Finland's ambassador for innovation within the foreign ministry, currently the ambassador for cyber affairs. Russia is on your border. Finland is no stranger to misinformation. We woke up at our 2016 elections saying, oh my goodness, the Russians are interfering through online misinformation. Finland had already experienced that in previous elections. So let me turn it over to you to try to give us a little bit about, especially about what Finland tries to do in order to insulate its elections from these kinds of this scourge, if you will.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
I hear you great. This is great.
Very
Thank
good,
you.
very good. No, thanks so much for having me, and it's great to join this very knowledgeable and distinguished panel. And as always, it's a pleasure to contribute to the activities of the Peacetechlab. Now, firstly, I would agree that the problem is indeed existential, because open societies, as we know them, and perhaps the very notion of the values of enlightenment are under attack from its enemies, both from the outside and from within. And the outside and inside, if you will, enemies. And I don't want to sound too much like a national security freak, but let's face it, those outside and those within, they often work in sync. And then the harmful memes start living lives of their own, just like viruses. And as somebody put it, misinformation and disinformation, and I just cannot help mentioning Facebook in this connection. I'm ready to name names if necessary. Disinformation is turning some of our elderly, mild relatives into Blut und Boden fascists, and it's terrible. Now, I also have a long background in the UN system, or with the UN system, from both the inside and the outside. So let me actually say a few words about the UN, and then perhaps in the next round also say a few words about Finland and how we have tried to make ourselves resilient. The UN is important because it is the only truly global framework for everybody. At the same time, we also need to bear in mind that the UN, in the end of the day, is a political organization where open societies must try and work together with authoritarian governments. And sadly, these days, the latter, the authoritarians, seem to feel that they are ascendant. But the one thing that brings consolation of sorts is the fact that for the most part, senior UN officials, including the Secretary General, the current one included, still share the values that the UN was built on. And that I want to raise this because it is important that those values were reflected in the current Secretary General's landmark report from last fall, entitled Our Common Agenda, where he actually raised the erosion of trust and solidarity as one of the greatest challenges of our times, at this inflection point that we are currently living through in so many ways. And as he put it, and I quote, now is the time to end the infodemic plaguing our world by defending a common empirically backed consensus around facts, science, and knowledge. He called on the war on science to end. And he went on to say something that is very difficult to disagree on, namely that, and I quote, we must make lying wrong again, end of quote. To that end, he called inter alia for a global code of conduct that would promote integrity in public information. And this code would be facilitated by the UN, bringing together states, media outlets, regulatory bodies, and other stakeholders. And he actually mentioned, as examples of models to build on, the IPCC, the World Meteorological Organization's Scientific Advisory Panel, and the verified initiative for COVID-19. And he also highlighted the role of the UN system as a source of reliable data and evidence, because the UN system still provides public and verified information to help the world understand better the risks and opportunities, and to use our common foresight. And to that effect, he said that he plans to re-establish the Secretary General's Scientific Advisory Board, and also explore better linking together the various knowledge centers across the UN system. But as I already mentioned, the UN is also a sum of its parts, and it is only sometimes more than the sum of its parts. All too often, it is the authoritarians who end up making an imprint at the policy level. Just to give an example, last month, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution introduced by Pakistan and co-sponsored by the Central African Republic, Cote d'Ivoire, Eritrea, and Russia, entitled Countering Disinformation for the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. Who could disagree with that? It was characterized as a resolution to promote human rights, digital equality, and freedom of expression. On face value, it does support the SG's initiative on the Global Code of Conduct. But on closer inspection, however, it may turn out to be an example of the kind of lawfare that is becoming all too common, with the goal of creating norms giving states control of the information environment within their physical borders. So I would say, to conclude on the UN, that the glass is either half full or half empty, depending on how you approach it. But I would emphasize that across this vast system, and I have met many of them over the years, there are people working hard to defend the human-centric values that the organization was built on. Such examples are way too many to list, but it suffices to mention that even in the oft-maligned UNESCO, the UN's scientific organization, important work is being carried out. For example, in partnership with the European Union, UNESCO has recently engaged in two global projects, one called Coronavirus Facts and the other Social Media for Peace, both ambitioning to tackle harmful content and disinformation. Now, this serves as a handy segue to what I want to say next about Finland and European countries in general. As you said, Sheldon, European countries, including Finland, have been dealing with not just misinformation, but also aggressive disinformation and cyber attacks from our neighbors to the east. Now, Finland has been a member of the European Union since 1995. And we entered together with Sweden and Austria, and then later most of the post-Soviet or the Soviet Empire, Central and Eastern European states, including the captive nations of the Baltics, which had been occupied for many a decade, joined the EU. And I would say that unlike for Finland and Sweden, a common legacy characteristic of the societies that were forced to live under a totalitarian system is, on average, a greater lack of trust in institutions than in the old West. This is not to say that there aren't differences among the Western European countries in this regard. My own country, Finland, like the other Nordics, usually ranks at the very top in terms of societal trust, both horizontally among people in each other and vertically in terms of the trust that people place in public institutions or the media. And this is also not to say that all of Europe, like the United States, as you said, Sheldon, would have been more immune to malicious hybrid warfare coming from those that share our values than the new members of the EU. On the very contrary, and I've also been a keen student of American politics for a long time. The very DNA of the American society is based on a high level of distrust in government, dating from the early years of the Republic and the Revolution. It is now sadly also characterized by what I would describe as an Ayn Randiesque mindset about one's place in society. Atlas shrugged. This has severely eroded this horizontal trust among citizens. And this is very fertile ground for mis- and disinformation. Now, back to the European Union, because for Finland, it is the main vehicle to try and scale up our voice in this joint effort to fight disinformation and malicious cyber activity. And as we all know, the European Union is the last best hope of humankind. I'm saying this only in half jest.
A little bit of misinformation there, Jarmo.
Sorry?
A little misinformation.
Yeah. Combating disinformation is increasingly on the EU's agenda. And of course, as Finland has been quite successful for a number of reasons, we are quite often asked about how we do it. But on the EU, I would just note that just yesterday, the Special Committee on Foreign Interference of the European Parliament finalized its 18 months of inquiry, adopting a set of final recommendations. And in doing so, it noted that the European public and government officials are overwhelmingly, as they put it, overwhelmingly unaware of the severity of the threat posed by foreign autocratic regimes, in particular Russia and China. And therefore, the committee called on the EU to raise public awareness through training for people in sensitive functions. And it called upon the EU to beef up its capabilities and build a sanctions regime against disinformation. It also stressed the need for rules on social media platforms, which do serve as vehicles for foreign interference. And in this regard, let's also bear in mind that just last week, the Parliament voted to approve the initial draft of the Digital Services Act, a bill that aims not only to curb big tech's invasive advertising practices, but also hopefully pressures platforms to remove illegal content and products online, including hate speech and counterfeit goods. So what I'm trying to say here, coming to an end, is that regulation can have a role if it is done to foster innovation and a level playing field. And sometimes regulation is also needed to protect open society from its enemies and from the nihilistic vested interests that want to make a profit at the expense of our values. So I leave it at that, and
thank you, Jarmo.
Some of the strengths of Finland at the next round.
That was great. It also gave us. I'm really interested to hear the extent of your confidence in international multilateral organizations, whether it was the UN, whether it was the EU, as where the locus should be for trying to deal with this problem? Because at the same time, you were also citing, for example, an 18-month study that revealed we were totally unaware of the order of magnitude of this problem. Similarly, this Aspen Commission in the United States, a Commission on Information Disorder, came out hair on fire. We must have a strategy in coming out of our government towards this. There seems to be a bit of a disconnect between the speed at which governments, multilateral as well as unilateral governments, are able to grapple with this issue, which seems to be growing exponentially. So I think this is a problem we should, this is a conversation we should come back and have once we hear from the other panelists. Mm-hmm. So thank you for teeing that up. And let me now, I think it's great to go to Lisa now after listening to Jarmo, because Lisa, your career has been in the peace building field, looking specifically at the relationship between technology and conflict prevention. You've also done extensive practical work in peace building alongside civil society, alongside the World Bank, UNDP. So how are you thinking about where the solutions, how we should be approaching this problem? What lessons can we take away from the peace building conflict resolution field?
Thank you, Sheldon, for that introduction. And I first of all want to say, I think the EU is really at the cutting edge in terms of trying to figure out what to do about this. So I want to applaud those efforts and note that many of these big technology companies are based in the United States, and the US Congress has the most power to implement reforms and regulations. And the lack of progress and ability of our own political system to address the existential threat that disinformation poses, really it should be at the top of the US policymakers' agenda. And I regret that we have so many other dilemmas because of disinformation that our own political system now is dysfunctional. And so I think we definitely need to turn to the UN, the EU, to try to get us out of this. I want to compare disinformation, false information, fake news, whatever you want to call it, to pollution. It's information pollution. And these companies are dumping information pollution into our everyday lives. They have distorted reality. Some people call it sort of epistemic insecurity. Nobody knows what's true anymore. And the lack of ability to look at the world and have shared facts is collapsing political systems around the world. The US at the front of that. But we often don't pay a lot of attention to what's happening in places like Afghanistan, where the companies like Facebook are spending a lot of money in their trust and safety teams on trying to remove disinformation from the US context. So they know that they're being held to some account for doing that. In a place like Afghanistan, it's less than 1% of disinformation that they're removing. These are the wealthiest companies on the planet. So Facebook is making billions of dollars on all of us, sort of all the information they're extracting from wherever we go on the web, but then also from all the ads we're seeing on their platform. So their profit model is actually at the heart of driving us to consume false information, which are, again, it's toxins. I think some of the proposals for taxing companies on pollution, just as companies who pollute the environment are taxed, is a really necessary principle for responding here. The second thing is that these companies should be forced to buy insurance for the negative impacts, just like the example you gave from South Sudan, Sheldon. The people who are killed because of false information on Facebook, they have every right to sue that company and get compensation. And we know now from Myanmar that the Rohingya are suing Facebook because of the genocidal violence that was unleashed upon them based on false information on Facebook. And that, you know, we were only mentioning a handful of countries here, but it's happening in every country around the world, where this flooding of pollution, information pollution, false information, is polarizing, dividing societies that were already divided, and it's posing an even greater wedge. It's undermining democratic elections, and it's translating into real-time violence. There is an article from Harvard that was just released actually this month that I think is relevant to our conversation. Part of the discussion from a peace-building point of view about any sort of intervention into a conflict or a difficult situation is, how much do you try to stop the bad stuff versus how much do you try to build resilience, build immunity, sort of focus on social cohesion. And what this new Harvard study shows is that we may be better off trying to really secure where is true information coming from, and highlighting and centering that and amplifying the facts, the truth, in addition to sort of penalizing people and taxing people for the false information, because companies, you know, they've tried moderating, deplatforming. There's many strategies to try to stop the flow of false information, but they're pretty limited and they have very limited impact. One of the things that makes such a focus on highlighting the true information, what makes that difficult is the political polarization in the United States. So when Facebook wanted to feature some sort of centralized information and highlighted sort of credible news sources like the New York Times, you know, the accusation was from the right wing in this country that this was somehow politically biased, and that their right-wing news sources, which were often the source of false information about who won the election or what kind of interference there was in the election, you know, it became a political dispute to sort of say, well, if New York Times, which is deemed left wing by the right wing, if the New York Times is going to be highlighted, then you have to also highlight a right wing source of news. So in some sense, the U.S. is past the point where we'll be able to deal with this with actual legislation in our own country. But again, this Harvard study really does show us that we may be better off by really looking at how to highlight that true information. I'll save the rest of my comments for the next round. Thanks.
Lisa, can I just ask you about the last point, the Harvard study? Because, you know, there is a fair amount of research showing that while we might want to emphasize the truth, you know, give it a more central role, that in fact what spreads like wildfire is that which is untrue, more salacious. Of course, that a lot of that can be connected with the algorithms that serve that up, and which is back to your point about the companies themselves. But it's also part of human nature. I wonder whether you have any thoughts about, you know, those studies that have come out showing that it is in fact the misinformation that really spreads so much faster.
So yeah, the MIT study showed that false information spreads 6 times as fast as true information, and you're very right. Sort of, but the design of the platforms, the algorithms are really amplifying the worst aspects of human nature, our fear of others, sort of the homophilia, this wanting to reinforce the beliefs that we have, and one side, one political party against another. And these are things that peace-building organizations have been working at for a long time and trying to build social cohesion. So it's a good point that, you know, it's very difficult work.
Yeah, but some really good points here. In fact, I think you're really teeing up John here. John, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I'm just experiencing some echo, but I can hear you.
Okay. Well, we hear you just great. Sometimes that's a matter of, let me turn down my volume. Sometimes that can help with the echo.
No, it's just cut through all the discussion, but it's okay. I've just been struggling to keep up.
Got
It's
it.
okay.
Got it. Sorry. Well, I'm, we've heard Lisa's focus on dealing with it both at the company level as well as the international fora that the EU has made some great contributions towards. You run a company, you run a media company, you've built one of the leading independent news media organizations in Africa, headquartered in Nigeria. It's so impressive. I remember reading in the Financial Times once, it was described as the most trusted news voice in Africa. So let me get your take on this as somebody who has to wrestle with these problems that Lisa was talking about within the online context. You have both an online outlet and a broadcast outlet. So give us that perspective. I mean, you have both an online outlet, a broadcast outlet, and Nigeria is a country of 50 languages. So you certainly cannot rely on any social media company to police the content, because they're going to be useless when it comes to Hausa or any of the other languages. So give us your perspective on how you weigh these different factors, what goes out over on air, online, and how you try to retain your position as the most trusted voice in Africa.
Thank you very much, Sheldon, and it's great to be part of this panel. I'm highly delighted to be part of you. There's any statement that I think will encapsulate what's happening in our industry and around the world, because it affects everybody. I would just say, I hazard a guess and say that we're in the middle of a perfect misinformation storm, and it's deadly. And this is something that is of great concern to everybody, and that's why we're having this discussion. Now, let me give you two stories. Pre-COVID, we had the Ebola scare, and we had an index patient who came into the country and brought in Ebola, and he was on the outskirts of Lagos. Now, just a few hours after the news broke that we had this patient in the country, news spread that the driver who took him from the airport to the hospital where he's been isolated had taken off, and he was wanted, and that he was demanding 100 million, otherwise he would not turn himself in. Now, this created a lot of scare for everybody, but it was false. And then let's move from there and go to even the highest seat of power in Nigeria, where the president in 2019 was said to be a double of himself, and that he had passed on. And there was a lot of credence given to this on social media, and people were sharing it. In fact, I think that story, the video went viral and was shared 500,000 times. It did a lot of havoc, but of course the president had to be forced to go publicly and to deny, in this case, that he is still alive, to deny the fact that he's not a double. But if you now bring it down home to the professionals themselves, we have also been culprits in this regard. By we, I mean some of our colleagues. I'm going to focus on Nigeria in particular. We had a newspaper publisher who had gone on print to say that a very popular pastor had gone to the American embassy seeking for a visa and was denied, and it was creating a lot of trouble in the embassy, and was arrested. It took the embassy to release a statement to say this man has a valid visa and had no need to come to the embassy for a visa. And his church also did that. Now, these are stories that are going around, that went around at that period, and they're still going around. And what has really exacerbated this is the fact that WhatsApp platform is what everybody seems to have turned to after Twitter was banned in Nigeria, 222 days after Twitter is back, and we're beginning to see that upsurge again in false news. So as a broadcaster, we have checks and balances. In fact, in broadcasting circles, it's been said that we should double check our stories before they go on air. On the digital department and in the linear department, we'll make sure that at all times we triple check. Because if you don't do that and you sacrifice, you sacrifice truth on the altar for the sake of reporting the news first, you might get into trouble. And that's why channels is very fortunate to be synonymous with the truth. We don't rush to break stories. We've seen a lot of our colleagues get their fingers burnt and gotten into trouble because of that. And government is not finding this funny. Government itself is clamping down on a lot of people a lot of publishers who are reporting stories. And then it becomes very fuzzy because on one hand, government is using that as an excuse to clamp down on the press. On the other hand, the people themselves they are saying that, look, there's need for freedom of expression in Nigeria. So it's a very difficult thing in Nigeria. One of the ways that we'll try to stem this false news is to see how we can help ourselves as the peer groups to see how we can get ourselves to check ourselves by coming up with an organization known as the Society of Nigerian Broadcasters, who will now be saddled with the responsibility of making sure that people are well trained and report factual stories at all times. So Nigeria, as it is, it's in a crossroads. We've had a lot of ethno-religious wars, tribal wars that are happening because of the force of the information. And I suspect that if we somehow try to hazard accurate figures, the numbers of those who have tragically died due to direct or indirect influence of misinformation will be far more greater than the number of people who have died from the pandemic. This is very worrisome. And so there must be a concerted effort on the part of everyone to make sure that fake news is checkmated. It is not a new phenomenon. There's always been rumors, there's always been propaganda, but technology has sort of accentuated everything. So we're caught in a web wherein what do we do? We have to go to the social media where the people are, since the industry has been so disorientated. We have to go there and make sure that we take the stories there and tackle the information that are coming out. But I'd like to suggest that it is high time that we make sure that the technology companies are held accountable, as is being espoused in different parts of the world. I believe that also that there's need for us, if we must employ the use of AI and other algorithms, I think that it is important for us to be able to tag the source of any information so that you can actually click on a button and see who originated this story. If it's a fake news, then throughout the chain, we'll be able to say this originated from somewhere. But I know that we have a lot of crooks in our society who are very good at hacking computers and doing things untoward, and we'll try to circumvent that. But I believe that it's one thing that the technology companies can do: try as much as possible to see that we tag, or rather we try to identify the source of any fake news, the very origin of the fake news. Because the fake news starts with red color, it ends up being black. All along the way, people have included or tried to distort the picture. So it's a very worrisome situation. But as broadcasters in Nigeria, the watchword for us is that we must always check our stories. we must be factual. On a personal note, I have been subjected to attacks. During the NSAS protest in Nigeria, you had a lot of people who thought that we were not giving too much light to some of the destructions that were going on in Nigeria. Of course, we were doing that. The very first day the NSAS started, what happened was that it didn't start as a protest. There was just a skirmish somewhere, which we reported as the fourth story in our flagship bulletin. But Nigerians were incensed. What I mean by Nigerians are those people who were opposed to the police who they were protesting against. And they thought that as a news leader, it should be the #1 story. Believe it or not, during the NSAS protest, they were coming for us. They burned down the station, which was about 2 miles away from us, and were heading towards us. But we were just lucky that they turned back and had a rethink, because knowing that we've always been a factual news presenter in the Nigerian industry. So it's a big problem for us in Nigeria and elsewhere in the world. And I believe that this kind of a forum and the model has been suggested, will help go a long way in helping to check the situation that we found ourselves.
That's excellent, John. Thank you for giving us that window onto what you have to wrestle with there. I'm just curious, though. You talked about setting really high standards for journalism. You talked about the Society of Nigerian Broadcasters joining together to insist on setting a high standard of checking sources and so forth. But you also have a really robust online community. You have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people following channels broadcasting online. They're constantly commenting. And in those comments is a great opportunity for a lot of evil, hate speech, misinformation, disinformation to occur. So from your perspective as a broadcaster, how are you able to moderate that? Are you able to manage that? When you talk about asking the technology companies to be more responsible for the content on their platforms, would you be able to do the same as a broadcaster with your kind of large community online and the amount of comments and things that appear there?
Across the social media platforms, we have 11 million followers, and that's a huge number. Considerably in the country of 200 million people, that's still just about 5%. But 11 million number of followers is huge for Nigeria, because people are watching us not only online, but also on linear television and on cable and satellite. This is a problem that requires a solution that has not been found yet, and we're doing everything possible to make sure that we do it. What we did in the case of Twitter was to turn off the comments section, because we're beginning to find out that they were being trolled. Personally, I was being trolled. Personally, all our news anchors. The fact that you appear on television to read the news and you do not say what people want to hear, which is false news, incenses the people, and so we were forced to turn off the comments function on our Twitter handle, and as well as on I think it's YouTube, but YouTube is back now to allow people to have the freedom to comment. It gets so bad that we've had to employ security for the staff when they're closing very late at night. Our flagship ends at 11 p.m. at night. It starts from 10 o'clock, and it's an hour newscast, apart from the other news that we have on a daily basis. But we've had to, and anywhere anchors or reporters are going when they're traveling, and this is compounded by the fact that the security situation in Nigeria is very bad. We've had to employ the use of policemen to be guards for them everywhere they go to, and plainclothesmen to guard them. Because I've had the unfortunate incident of having two of my staff felled by bullets from the police during protest and go. So whenever they're on the road, it's one of those things that keeps me, my eyes open at night when they're traveling cross country, and then they're subject to attack anytime. But the truth is always constant. So when people see that we are not pandering towards the left or the right, and we're trying to make sure that all sides of an issue is reported, then they come to the realization that we're being professional and we do the right thing. So we're able to do this apart from fact checking, apart from making sure that we do not rush to report our stories without making sure that it's the truth. We are the station to be reckoned with in the country in terms of news, and this helps us a great deal. Otherwise, we would have been in trouble.
Yeah. Well, thank you, and I think that is actually a good segue to Phil, who really is one of the world's experts on this problem, and I think that therefore you can appreciate John's desire for a solution, Lisa's desire for governments to get more serious about this, Jarmo talking about the companies, naming names. There definitely seems to be a lot of sincere, heartfelt urgency by responsible people here. What is your perspective, Phil, having, you were part of that Nobel Prize Summit, part of that discussion on the Intergovernmental Panel for the Information Environment. Your book, Lie Machines, really makes clear the magnitude and the urgency of the problem. What is your thought now, listening to these folks, on the state of the solution sets when it comes to grappling with this problem?
Yes, thank you, Sheldon, for involving me in this great conversation. I think several of the key ingredients for the solution set have already been identified. Right, Jarmo's talked about how important it is to have a muscular regulator, and the EU is probably going to be that regulator. I think Lisa has some fabulous examples of how the citizens can use the toolkit of technology to perform the daily activism, to help make those corrections that might improve the quality of the information environment. And the story from John about the media enterprises in Nigeria organizing themselves, that's particularly interesting to me because it makes Silicon Valley look behind the times, right? The major technology firms have not been able to organize themselves. And almost any other industry, you'd think, faced with the same level of scrutiny from journalists, parliamentary committees, Senate committees would organize themselves. But the lessons from Nigeria actually are from Nigeria on this, and Silicon Valley hasn't kept up. So in an important way, I think I would guess that many of us agree that we're past the point of industry self-regulation, right? It no longer makes sense to sort of wait or leave it for the technology firms to step in and organize themselves. The question is how much to do, how much leadership to offer, and how to prevent over-regulation. I think one of the things that surprised me over time is the degree to which the production of misinformation has transferred from authoritarian governments to democracies. I was living in Budapest when in 2014, this was the summer that Malaysian Airlines flight was shot down over Ukraine. And I watched my Hungarian friends get at least three equally ridiculous stories, right? There was the story of the US troops in Ukraine had shot the flight down. There was the story that democracy advocates thought Putin was on the plane flying commercial from Amsterdam to Malaysia. And then my favorite was the story of the lost tank from World War II that had been stuck in the in the great forests of Ukraine all these years and had emerged confused and accidentally shot the plane down. And it's at that point that we realized that the misinformation process is not about presenting one story, one narrative that you can respond to or engage with, but it's about providing multiple, conflicting, sometimes equally ridiculous stories that make it hard to respond, right? You can't address these things one story by story. It's proving too difficult. The challenge is how to deal with things systematically. We don't want to create a ministry of truth, right? We can't have a centralized arbiter. We shouldn't try to create a centralized arbiter of truths. The best thing we can do is perhaps audit these systems, perhaps have some public scrutiny over the firms. The firms often make claims about things they do to improve their algorithms, but there's no way of demonstrating that our news feeds are getting any better or that the quality of the content is improving over time. And of course, COVID has set this into such sharp relief, right? This is easily one of the most complex misinformation operations I've ever seen. It ties in a long-standing myths about Bill Gates and a long-standing story about the government trying to put chips in our arms, combined with some of the confusing positions that our health professionals have taken. Masks, no masks, and for a while we had a major Western leader, right, generating misinformation with global consequences. There has also been a fairly middle-class anti-vax movement that's been around for 20, 25 years. And if a Hollywood star or a major political figure retweets some misinformation about COVID, its consequences, or its cures, that creates immense cascade effects. I think I hit a new career low about a month ago. We did a story about an information operation to blame lobsters from Maine for the COVID crisis. This was about a shipment of lobsters that had arrived in Wuhan from Maine right around the time that the earliest cases were detected. And it was the most ridiculous operation. It must have had thousands of personnel hours behind it, multiple platforms. And it's at that point that I sort of decided that I didn't want to work on catching information operations anymore, because they get more and more ridiculous, and there's more and more of them. I think dealing with it systematically is going to involve having some credible oversight, a group of researchers who can look under the hood, examine things, audit, verify, monitor. I think several of us have been observing the situation for a while. I'd also say we're past the point of trying to make observations, right? We're at the point of needing to verify that some changes are working well, to identify which policy initiatives from governments around the world work, and then transport those policies, right? And many of us have been through an election, at least one, that seems tainted or almost went off the rails because of misinformation. Elections are particularly sensitive points in public life, and they may be our starting point, right? Getting the rules around the behavior of the media, including Facebook and social and Twitter, getting the rules around how politicians conduct themselves, getting those in place in time for elections may help sort of light a fire under people to get organized in time. Those elections are also often the breaking points for young democracies or countries where the ethnic strife is persistent. Those elections are sensitive moments, so they may be an important intervention point for us.
Phil, you mentioned the Maine lobster campaign, which, correct me if I'm wrong, was Chinese orchestrated.
PRC,
PRC.
The people, government.
You mentioned the Hungarian tank sham. I'm assuming that was
I believe Russian government origins. Yeah.
So let me ask you something. We can talk about the practices, as you just suggested, that are working in different governments, in different places, in different ways. We can talk about point-to-point solutions. Do you ever grapple systematically with this problem if you are not involving the Chinese, the Russian, our other adversaries in this effort? We lost you. I don't know why we lost your sound. Now you're back. You're back now.
I don't think it's going to be possible to make progress on this without collaborating in some ways with the research communities in China and Russia. I think it's in an important way that some of the big actors, the gorillas in the room, are state-backed media agencies, and I don't mean sort of the professional news outlets where there's public investment in journalism. I think there must be a set of humanitarian issues, climate change, global health, complex humanitarian disasters, certainly moments of conflict where all parties should want accurate and open information, refugee crisis, earthquakes, natural disasters. There are these moments where the humanitarian community needs to bound together, and the international community often does, to provide the resources to help those in the most dire of needs and emergency settings. Those may be the starting point, right? I think it's going to take a long-term conversation with many different kinds of governments to get us to clean up the information environment together. But there must be some starting points. Water security, water scarcity. I'm curious to know what the others think those safe issues might be for even the most authoritarian of governments. There must be a short list that we can start on.
So I think you're bringing us full circle. Jarmo, I'm going to come back to you now because Phil is, basically saying you're not going to make real progress without a global effort. There needs to be some science, some analysis that surfaced around shared problems. And that's basically the heart and soul of the proposal that he and I have been talking about a lot for this Intergovernmental Panel on the Information Environment, the IPIE. So let me go back to you, Jarmo, and get your reaction specifically to that proposal. I think we sent you the op-ed piece that we produced for that on CNN. What is your thinking about a mechanism like that, given your extensive UN experience, and how you think, whether or not you think we could bring in a global coalition around this?
Thanks, Sheldon. Even if I'm often a skeptic regarding the UN, I think that in the end of the day, we just got to keep trying. There's no other alternative. And as I said earlier, the UN is the only truly global organization. And even if the authoritarians even if they seem to feel that they can own the libs, to put it in the UN context, own the democratic societies, we just got to try and work with everybody. And in this regard, as I said earlier, the senior leadership of the UN shares very much the values of the Enlightenment and the UN's own charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all that. So we have an ally in them. And as I mentioned, the Secretary General did give the IPCC as one of the possible models for his own code of conduct. And importantly, he also called on that code to be built together with the relevant stakeholders from the private sector and others. Excellent ideas often tend to get buried in the UN's intergovernmental process. A panel of this kind, if one tried, and we need to try, would face serious headwinds from the authoritarian governments, especially as it would, to be effective and to matter, it would have to include all those stakeholders.
Yeah.
And I have recently witnessed, in the context of the UN's open-ended working group on cyber, how very difficult it is to give these stakeholders, be they private sector or civil society, to give them a real voice in the UN. Authoritarian governments would probably know that such a panel would not work to their favor. Now, the Secretary General could appoint a panel under his own authority, give it a advisory role to himself, as he did some years back when he established and appointed the high-level panel on digital cooperation. That panel, and of course that was some years back, the geopolitical situation was not as bad as it is now. It was getting very bad. But that panel was established, it worked. The co-chairs were Melinda Gates and Jack Ma. And it came with a report that in the light of its carefully crafted composition was not bad. One could probably share each and every recommendation therein. On the whole, it was built on human-centric values. Mm-hmm. So he could do it. Funding would have to come from voluntary contributions, but I still believe that such a panel in an advisory role could set in motion something else, as the high-level panel did with the ensuing roadmap that the SG came up with himself in 2020. And that has now morphed into our common agenda.
Good.
So we need to take a long-term view on this.
Yeah, thank you, Jarmo. And I'm certain that we would need your help, Finland's help, if we were ever to move something like this forward in a global fashion. You guys would be pivotal to bringing in some of our more adversarial partners, I think. Let me go to you though, Lisa, because you come from the world of peace building. As Jarmo was intimating, you didn't come out and say it, Jarmo, but you were intimating, information is a tool of asymmetric warfare. That's why it is going to be so difficult to have a robust, direct, honest, global conversation about this with our adversaries at the table. How do you think about this coming from the conflict resolution field? Do you think this concept of modeling a body on the IPCC has merit? Something's happening with your sound as well. Hold on.
Sorry, my mute was on. Okay. So I agree with you that this is a global problem. It's a global threat, and we need the UN to have a panel, because one-by-one solutions. Finland has given us a lot of role models for digital media literacy, which is one of the questions in the chat. I think every country should be modeling our education system after what you have done in Finland, because it needs to be mainstreamed in our educational curriculum. But I think we need to also think about this as a peace process. So as a mediator, then sort of facilitating very difficult conversations with Russia. I think the conversations are a bit different with China, because actually their social media system is better than the US system in some ways, because they have thought about issues of addiction in a way that the US has not. So they have limits to at least limit the personal harms from kids spending huge amounts of time on social media. they have some interesting ideas about how to do that. We might not want to replicate it. And as we know, there's huge amounts of surveillance and strategic distraction, which are the Chinese methods, which is not so much putting out false information, but just as Phil was noting, just flooding it with Hello Kitty and personal interest stories. So people are distracted from the actual discussions that are important to their life. So I think we need to separate what China and Russia are doing and how they operate, because it's somewhat different. I think the main point for an international panel is that the number of researchers at universities devoted to fixing this problem is huge. Those of us trying to keep up with reading all the new literature and research on ideas, it's quite a dilemma. And we need a panel who is delegated to bring the best solutions and the best research and to keep up with how we can do this. So yes, I think sort of the way the climate panel has been able to negotiate and mediate between some of the different interests is exactly what we're needing.
That's great. I'm going to come back to that point you just made, Lisa, about researchers working on this problem. I'm going to give you, Phil, the last word on that when I come back, because that's what you have been doing, running at the Oxford Internet Institute, and I think it's a really, really important question about the how are you able to do it? How are you able to actually get the data that we need around this? Has it gotten worse? Has it gotten easier to study these questions, given the importance of it? So thank you for teeing that up there, Lisa. But I wanted to go back to John first. Just quick response from you, John, about your thoughts on, this concept of an international panel for the information environment, studying this problem, surfacing analysis data around how information is flowing around the world, and really looking very carefully at what are the short-term, medium-term, and long-term effects if we don't deal with this problem. What is your reaction from a Nigerian broadcaster's perspective? We're not getting your sound again. You're not muted, are you? Now you're back. Now you're gone. Sorry, John, your sound is gone again. You had it back a second. No. Oh, I think we just lost John in his entirety. Well, I'll get his perspective when he gets back in here. But there we go. He's right there. Let's see if it works. And folks who are on the call, we will go to questions after. In 5 minutes, we're going to go right to questions and close out with those. So, John, your reaction? Can we hear you? No, we're not getting your sound for some reason or another. All right, I'm going to go to you, Phil. That question that Lisa was just teeing up about the research world, it does seem key if we were to have a global response to this problem.
Yeah, it does.
Am I live now?
Oh, wait, John, you back?
Yes, I am back now. I've had to enable the microphone on the iPad.
Oh, great. Well, we hear you fine. We're not seeing you, but we're hearing you fine.
Oh my God.
Yeah, don't worry. It's your dulcimer tones that are more important here. There we go. Now we got you. And we lost your sound. We lost your sound. We lost your sound, John. Go back to the iPad. Sorry. We're getting some interference there.
Shall I try and answer to those good
Yes,
questions?
please,
While John
Phil,
reconnect.
jump in.
I think it's a tough one because there's some ways we actually have less data now than we did in 2016 when we 2017 when we learned about the big crisis. There was a major initiative from Facebook to try and share data to academics called Social Science One. It didn't quite end up sharing what everybody thought it would share, and then there've been some problems with the actual rollout. Twitter has been doing a good job putting up information about the networks it catches. It's slowed down a little bit in the last 6 months, and it's launching a new program for researchers. So, do we have systematic access for independent researchers or journalists or civil society groups to double check things? No, the fact checkers work more or less on their own and are sort of dependent on financial support from philanthropy, from the big foundations. Journalists are getting savvier. There's more and more data journalism. They're getting better at probing, but we don't have access. As I said earlier, we can't look under the hood. There's no data sharing, and some of this information, I think, could be anonymized, could be shared with the National Institutes of Health, with the European Research Council in Europe, the really large scientific organizations that already have systems for anonymizing data and parsing it out in protected ways to researchers who can test out their theses and look for patterns. We don't have that system. We don't have access at the moment, and I think it's time for industry to tithe, in a sense. The best data on public problems is not in the library. It's not with public institutions. It's in Silicon Valley, and until we can unleash some of the power of that data, it's going to be hard to identify the scope of a problem and solve it collectively.
So, Phil, it's fair to say, I'm a social media company. I make my money off that data. We won't expect them to give us this data because it is the currency of the realm. How do you get around that?
Well, I think it turns out that the data is also really degrading to the realm. So, in this metaphor, I'd say that sharing a small portion of it, there must be ways to separate the industry's, a firm's unique IP, keep things secure. We already have ways of auditing financial algorithms. We already have ways of auditing video gambling machines. There's a number of auditing processes out there that keep the IP of a firm secure, but ensure that there isn't damaging code that can break a market or cheat people out of their money. So we already have some of those trusted systems. I think the tough task is to figure out how to port them over into this new domain.
John, let's see if we can we hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. That's great. We hear you.
Okay, we'll try it before it goes out again.
No, we hear you and see you. Go for it.
Okay. I was saying that it's the Jambo actually nailed it when he said that it might be worthwhile for it to come from the office of the Director General himself. I think that will make it give it all the seriousness it deserves, and they'll need to have commitment, great commitment from all those who will be involved in this. But I would also like to suggest that rather than make it too multilateral and come from a top-down approach, I think it will be good for it to come from the regional level, so that you have regional models that will now culminate at a central level, where the UN will be the one to coordinate it, or whichever bodies given the responsibility to take care of the issues that are involved here. I think that way, then everybody will be involved, because when you set up such a body that's international in nature, just like the IPCC, commitment is always a problem. So unless we have commitment, and great commitment on the part of all and sundry, then it will just be an exercise in futility. But I think it's doable, and I think with the Peacetechlab, for instance, serving as an engine for it, should be something that should be able to work work very well. As for broadcasters, we can also emulate that. We'll be more than concerned. As being a past president of the Broadcasters Association of Nigeria, I'll be able to, with my colleagues, galvanize each other to see how we can join the Society of Nigerian Broadcasters to work towards a society that will be minimized of fake news and the dangers inherent.
John, before I lose you again, since we got your sound, I want to take one of the questions. So we're going to go to the questions. We only have about 10 minutes left to go to a couple of questions. But, this is something that, Lisa, you mentioned earlier, but we really haven't talked about on this call. And I want to hear how you think about this in Nigeria. And Jarmo, I want to ask you as well how you think about this or approach this in Finland. So we really have not talked about. Sally on the call has said, for the US specifically, isn't individual education rather than just chasing bad actors key to change? It's a massive task that must involve young people as well. So she's really teeing up this topic of media literacy, and that it's not just a problem of supply, it is also a problem of demand. John, is that a conversation happening in Nigeria about how to educate people, and specifically young people, on fake news, disinformation, misinformation? And Jarmo, I'd really love to hear what's the state of play in Finland as well. So, John, quickly, while I know I've got you on
yes,
the live line.
Absolutely, it's imperative that media literacy is accentuated. Because if the so-called digital natives, the young ones, know nothing else but to live in a bubble and the social media, and that's their life. That's where they work. And you have a large percentage of them who know nothing but that, and the fall prey most of the time to the kind of stories that come that are usually fake news. So if one was to have a system or a literacy campaign that will help them to distinguish, be able to see the dangers and to distinguish between what is fake and what is factual and what is verified, particularly honing in on the mainstream media who will move into the social media platforms to see how they can combat this effects of the try and checkmate the stories that are originating around the social media, then that will be a great help. And I think that's one way to go. And that's why most media organizations, if not all, are on the social media trying to take the news to where the people are. And so to have a campaign that will let people know what is good and what is not good will have a great deal to ameliorate the problem that we face.
Is it discussed in the Nigerian education system? Is there
it's not been incorporated into it, but it's something that has to be suggested. Yes.
Jarmo, very curious how you in Finland, who's been besieged by Russian disinformation for years, how you approach this question of media literacy.
Finland ranks as at the very top in terms of the media literacy of its citizens. This has been a consistent result of international comparisons, and it can be credited to a great extent to the fact that we incorporate critical thinking and media literacy skills into our school curriculum, as I noted in the chat. So it all starts at school. I would also agree with what somebody said in the chat, that young people tend to be more immune to disinformation because they have grown with it. It is the older folks who end up being these Blut und Boden, blood and soil fascists all too easily. But it's about media literacy, it's about school curriculum, and it's also about the fact that you need to make an effort to keep your media outlets, quality. And in this sense, what happened in the 80s in the US in the deregulation of the media industry, the fairness doctrine being thrown out, there are results. And media, quality media also means that people have faith, people have trust in these outlets. Thanks.
Thank you, Jarmo. We have a lot to learn from how you all have approached it in Finland. We have a wonderful question here from Fred that I think is actually a terrific one to go out on, and I'd like to pose it first to you, Lisa, and then Phil, same question. Fred wrote, "It seems that similar to peace building, there needs to be 3 levels of approaches, like John Paul Lederach's pyramid: top leadership, middle range leadership, and grassroots leadership. How do we work on this issue at all 3 levels?" Lisa, you're very familiar with Lederach's pyramid. How do you think about it in the context of this problem?
Thanks. And yeah, I think it's important for this audience here at PeaceCon,
yes,
an audience mostly of people working in the field of peace building who recognize now the impact that information disorders are having on conflicts and violence, and undoing the work that we've been working on for decades and making it more difficult to have peace treaties, peace negotiations, etc. So I think that's a very important question coming from Fred. And absolutely, we need a multi-stakeholder response. In the chat, I put a link to my book. The whole last chapter of my book has a multi-stakeholder framework for responding to disinformation, which tries to look at those top, middle, and grassroots level strategies that basically everybody needs to be involved. This is a whole of society problem. We need whole of society solutions.
Phil, over to you. Thinking about leadership.
What a fabulous question. I mean, I think my favorite solutions at each of these levels for the broad public, I mean, the things we should also do as individuals, we need to read the stuff. We read stuff before we share it, right? That's something each of us can do. We all have our cognitive biases, and before we share things with our friends and family, we need to read it and think about the source, and then forward or put it in the trash, right? That's on us. I think the middle level work, many of us are finding that every civil society group these days needs a data analyst of some kind, right? There was a time when most of the major civil society groups needed a pollster, needed somebody who could, at least install the tech, get the computers up and running. Now they need at least a data scientist to be able to play with data to detect these campaigns when they're starting to impact the domain in which they work. And then for the top level leadership, I think it's about building literacy. The more we can get our senior public officials to be aware of the positive and constructive things you can do to battle misinformation, the more likely we are to keep it on the international agenda long term.
That's excellent. Let me give you my take on that last leadership question, and this is going to be, and then I'm going to go around and give everybody 60 seconds for last word and any final thoughts that anybody else might have before we sign off. But I'm taking away from this conversation where there's pretty consistent agreement, and there's lots and lots of discussion of holding technology companies accountable. There's a lot of discussion about making sure the frameworks are correct it's different in Finland, it's different in Nigeria, it's different in England where you are, Phil, it's different in the United States, of making sure that national efforts to tackle this problem it's happening appropriate to the nation. But at the same time, my big aha from this conversation is that I think we've really agreed that it is a global problem, and it is worth the effort. I share your skepticism, Jarmo. I do. UN agencies move at a glacial pace, but the effort needs to be a global effort. And that's something, to be honest with you folks, that's not the conversation right now. All the panels that we've talked about, EU panels, and it's happening a bit in the UN, yes. And Jarmo reminded us of pronouncements that have come out of the Secretary General's office, but not happening enough, certainly in our country and in most of the governments. So I think this is I'm leaving this with renewed eagerness to work this problem from a global perspective. So I'm going to reverse order of how we started, and Phil, final thoughts, and then I'll go to John.
My final thought would be that I think we're all cynical, but don't have to be fatalistic. It's not too late. There's still some things we can change, and I'm operating on fumes at the moment, but I think it is possible to adjust the system and fix the big problem. It's essential that we do so.
John, final word?
Yeah, I think there's no solution without a problem. This is a problem that has come upon us, and we must solve it. And it's solvable. It's just the commitment that they require. And I think the model that's been introduced or been suggested is one way to go. And I believe that it's doable all over the world.
Lisa, final thought?
We could talk all day about the problems of the United Nations and its need for reform, but the world would be worse off without it. I think it's definitely worth a try to look at global solutions.
Well said. Jarmo, you get the last word. But you have to unmute if you want it.
Yeah, 3 points. Firstly, things look really bad, but we haven't lost the battle. It just needs awareness, shared situational awareness, and persistence at all levels. So the first point, battle is not lost. Second, I often ask myself if it's going to be the mega capitalists that will rescue us. I don't think so. We have all seen enough with their misanthropy and narcissism. It's not going to happen. And finally, third point on Russia and China. Are they going to be needed for a solution? Ideally, yes. Is there a will on their part? I hope there would be, but we still need to try and engage them. And then finally on Russia. Asymmetric warfare, just below the threshold of use of kinetic force, is their forte. And they're being very effective in that. They have disrupted the information market, just like Airbnb disrupted the hospitality market. So they're smart, and it's cost effective, but we still would need to try and engage them. Thank you.
Well, Lisa teed up the approach of pollution, dealing with information pollution, and Jarmo, I think you're teeing up the approach of disarmament in this conversation. Thank you all very much. Thanks to our audience that's been here. This has been a terrific panel. I know I am much richer for having listened to the four of you. Thank you very, very much for putting aside the time to educate all of us. And thanks again to PeaceCon, to the Alliance for Peace Building, for giving us this opportunity to have this really important discussion, which, as we all agree, could go on for hours and hours and hours. Thanks again. Really appreciate everybody being here. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.